And now it's time for a round of rank punditry here on New Hampshire Journal. We'll do it every week, and we have some brand new polling numbers to discuss with someone who has run presidential campaigns himself, Jim Merrill, and someone who should have run for president and did not, former Congressman and State Senator Jeb Bradley. Senator, how are you?
I am great, Michael. How are you? Happy to be on with you. Jim, good morning.
By the way, you must just be really missing your old job watching the legislature this past week. I know you wish you were right in there slinging away, don't you?
You know, I am happy to be doing what I'm doing. I loved, I loved being in the Senate for all those years, but I'm watching carefully. And, before we get to your poll, I just want to say this. I think Republican chances begin with Governor Ayotte this fall. I think she's in a very strong position. I think she's done an excellent job as governor. She's articulated, the New Hampshire advantage, why an income tax or sales tax massing up New Hampshire is the absolute wrong way to go. She's dealt with a really difficult budget situation. I love the fact that she's advocated for children's mental health, Senate Bill 498. She's done a great job taking on insurance companies on that, who should be ashamed of themselves. They're foisting costs on taxpayers. So, again, I think, across the board in the state and really as it affects the federal races, Michael, Governor Ayotte's in a very strong position to lead the ticket.
Jim Merrill, isn't that exactly the messaging that Governor Ayotte wants to have come out of this session?
Oh, 100%. I mean, she's the adult in the room, and she's, she has done a nice job of triangulating and leading on issues that are going to be very attractive to a broad, swath of the electorate this fall. So, there's been a lot of talk about, challenges the party may face as we kind of head into November. But, she's the flagship, and we do very well by hitching our wagon to her and letting her lead. She's doing a great job, and she's leading on issues that I think are broadly, appealing to the electorate.
Right. Look, I think that this tough, hard-hitting campaign between Kelly Ayotte and Maura Healey is going to be a really race close to watch. I think it'll be right on the. Oh, I'm sorry. Maura Healey isn't the Democratic nominee for New Hampshire. I'm sorry. But I just want to say there are some cynics out there. As you know, Senator Bradley, I am a open-hearted, naive waif. I am not cynical at all. There's some cynics who say that Governor Ayotte has no interest whatsoever in this insurance policy itself, which impacts a small number of people, but she loves the fight with Anthem, the evil, big corporate insurance business. And she's more than happy to have the Republican legislature send her paint taxes and battery taxes for her to just knock them right out of the park with that veto pen. She's very happy with how things are shaping up. That's what some cynics might say, Senator Bradley.
Look, I think she's held the line on the paint tax and other taxes. She's articulated the New Hampshire advantage. I actually know that she really cares about children's mental health because she's advocated for it and has done a great job of taking on the insurance companies on that. As I said, they should be ashamed of themselves, the insurance companies. So, it's interesting when we hear the Democrats try to have it both ways. They say they're against an income tax, but then they won't vote to allow, voters to weigh in whether the Constitution should protect an income tax. They claim that if we just raise business taxes and restore, oh, by the way, it is the income tax on interest and dividends, we'll be able to lower property taxes. Michael, the interesting thing is, look around us. Who has higher property taxes in New Hampshire? Well, you start with Connecticut, and then there's Massachusetts, and then there's Maine, and then there's Vermont and New York, and Rhode Island and New Jersey are about the same level as us.
Right.
Guess what they all have? A sales tax and an income tax. And it's progressive in many of those states. So, I think, Kelly's phrase of don't mass up New Hampshire has really set the tone for her entire governorship. And she's done a really good job of making sure that people understand what it means to live in the Granite State and do things differently and better. Why are so many people from Massachusetts moving to New Hampshire? Well, guess what? It's because we have a
Exactly.
better standard of living, and it's more cost
Right.
effective to be here.
So Jim Merrill, can you imagine having to be House Minority Leader Alexis Simpson and go out on the floor and say, New Hampshire's spoken. They don't want an income tax. We hate the income tax. I don't know who that crazy guy is over there with the income tax. Oh, is it time to vote to ban the income tax? Well, I ain't going to vote for that.
Yeah. I mean, the gymnastics are great. I mean, it's really painful to see. And look, I mean, over the next 6 months, the Andy Volinskys of the world are not going to go away. They're
Of course
not going to
not.
stop talking about this. And to their credit, they feel passionately and you know, and they're going to just continue to hammer this. It's a really tough place for them to be. And so, you know, for us, I mean, I love that. You know, just to go back to your cynic point about Governor Ayotte for a second, I'll
Right.
say this. Look, I think they're not mutually exclusive. She likes
That's a
a
good
good
point.
fight, and she is passionate about mental health issues. She talked about it in her inaugural address, and I can
Right.
tell you, as someone who sits on a board of directors of a regional mental health center, I know that she cares about this a great deal. So
Sure.
I think she's leading with her heart here, but you know, with a political head too.
Yeah.
And it's a good issue, and so good for her for hammering it.
Doing well by doing good is
Right.
the phrase for that. One last thing before we get to these poll numbers, and that is the toll. You know, I've talked to people who are like, I don't understand, why does she oppose a toll on out of state drivers? And I think it's a matter. And I'll start with you, Jim Merrill, because this is your wheelhouse, which is political communications. You know, keep it simple, stupid. You know, just you don't give me. You bring Governor Kelly Ayotte something that costs normal people more money. She says no. And
Yeah.
that's her messaging. And I think that's why if the toll makes it to her desk, I predict she'll veto it because she doesn't want any lack of clarity on what it means to have a Governor Kelly Ayotte in the corner office.
I think that's right. I think, look, it is a cleaner, you know, more concise message that way. And I think also, and like people, I understand what people are saying. Hey, look, this is a user fee. There's people from out of
Right.
state that are doing this.
Sure.
But let's remember also how important tourism is to our economy. Let's have, you know, we talk about, you know, being an attraction to bring people across the border, not to live here, but to come up and enjoy all that we have to offer. And I think there's a concern that that messaging would be bad in terms of that element of our economy. So, but I think you're right on the messaging, and I think you're right in the fact that we're turning into what we care about most, which is our tourism economy.
Senator Bradley.
Yeah, I also think that, Governor Ayotte understands that if first it is, a tax on out-of-state
Right.
drivers, it's not a stretch to think that next year it's going to be a tax on
Exactly.
in-state drivers. So again, I think, she's worried about affordability of living in New Hampshire. We are different than all the states around us, and we should maintain that difference because
Right.
look at how we rank on all the major rankings in the country. Lowest poverty rate in the nation, among the lowest unemployment rates in the nation, among the highest per
Right.
capita income in the nation. And guess what? In US News and World Reports, they always do this livability ranking
Right.
every year. New Hampshire is the number 2 state in the country to live in.
Right.
And it starts with good governance. And,
Mhm.
Chris Sununu did a great job for the previous 8 years, and Kelly Ayotte has stepped into, big shoes
Right.
to fill and has done a great job herself. And I think,
Sure.
Cindy Warmington's going to have a very tough time trying to say, well, we should raise taxes on businesses and we should bring back an income tax on, retirees, and that'll just
Right.
solve our problems. We solve our problems by good governance. And Kelly Ayotte has done that.
Yeah,
You're not going to trick me. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to add, and I mean, look, I think the governor and her team all are very disciplined. You know, they're very disciplined.
Yes.
They are never going to embrace something where they say a tax or something isn't a solution, right? They're just not going to do that. And that is, I think, true to the way they govern. That's true to I think for the best interest of the state. So they're very disciplined, and they're doing that here, and it's the right move.
Well, I'm not going to get tricked into doing a public policy conversation with you two, but I will say that you want your state user fees for roads, which includes gas taxes, and your road costs to be here. Because when the revenue goes down, you got to go to non-drivers and take their money out of the general fund to make it up. And New Hampshire for decades has been great. And in the last 10 years, this has happened. So that gap, somebody's going to start talking about that, and that's going to be an issue for the future. Let's talk about the way down the road future, the 2028 presidential race. Why? Because we're New Hampshire. We're the first in the nation state. That's why every day is presidential campaign day, right, Jim Merrill? Every
Absolutely.
day.
And it's
And that
never that far away.
and that's another reason why we should be the first in the nation state. I think we got a boost, by the way, this week. If South Carolina does redraw their map and they draw that congressional district away for Jim Clyburn, I think that'll be the end of a first in the nation primary for them. Don't you guys? Isn't that a win for us?
Well, I think it's a
Don't you agree?
win for Republicans in general if they redraw those districts. I
Mm,
mean, redistricting is always an interesting phenomena. Everybody does it. Republicans do
mm,
it. Democrats do it. The Virginia situation
right,
has really cost Democrats a lot. So I think, the dynamic has shifted for the midterm somewhat in terms of
right,
Republicans, and you, Michael, have highlighted this in some of your pieces in New Hampshire Journal
right,
and done a great job with it. The dynamic has shifted to the point that Republicans may be more competitive than people
right.
thought, which is
Yeah,
good in New Hampshire too.
the phrase I heard from a guy down in DC was, I've stopped wanting to jump off the bridge every day when I'm coming to work. He's not hopeful, but at least he's not ready to jump off the bridge. But it's
Yeah.
one thing about, since I happen to know South Carolina, what's fascinating. And look, I actually know Representative Clyburn. I ran into him in a gas station a couple of summers ago when I was down vacationing. Um, when I lived in downtown Columbia, South Carolina, which is in the very center of the state, 2 hours away from Charleston, I lived in his congressional district. When I lived on the peninsula of Charleston, 2 hours away, I lived in his congressional district. When I went to visit my grandparents up in Myrtle Beach, 3 hours away, I lived in his congressional district. That's how crazy that map is to put all of the black voters in the state. And as a guy, and point of personal privilege, South Carolinians have so much in common that's beyond race. The idea that you need to that's just crazy. Trust me, the people in Florence and the people in Charleston, the people in Green, they're people, and their political interests are far, far more complicated and nuanced and real than just, oh, you happen to be black, I happen to be white. I find that district, having lived there and grown up there, just an insult to my everyday life, where you went to work every day with black coworkers and white coworkers, you went to the grocery store and whatever. So anyway, that's enough. Okay, here we go. New Hampshire, Republican primary voters. We talked to 300 of them, there's 350, excuse me, of them. Who is their top choice right now to be the nominee in 2028? JD Vance by astonishing numbers. 43% for JD Vance. Who's in second place? No, not Marco Rubio. It's Don Jr. at 15%. Then Marco Rubio at 10%. And then kind of surprising, Nikki Haley at 8%. Everyone else is in single digits after that, et cetera, et cetera. The one name that I jumped out because he's got a new book coming out and he's trying to rebrand himself is Mike Pence. Very nice guy, an earnest gentleman. 3.5%. He's down in the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. territory. So Jim Merrill, you've run presidential campaigns. You've worked on the Marco Rubio campaign here. What do you make of these numbers? What do they tell us about the mood of the New Hampshire Republican electorate?
Yeah, sure. So this is a great example, right? In the last few weeks, months too, but really in the last few weeks, it's been really hot in DC. And the reporting coming out of there about Vance and Rubio,
Right.
and is it, maybe it's going to be Marco instead. And I say this as someone who spent 2 years working with Marco in his 2016 presidential campaign. I love the guy, but the truth is this is JD Vance's nomination to lose,
Right.
and by a landslide. And he, I think, is seen very much right now as an extension of the president who remains very popular with the party. And so the idea that's happening in DC right now is not happening here in New Hampshire. We
Right.
don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if he's going to run. He may decide not to run. I think he probably
Right.
will. But if he doesn't, then I think what you're going to see is it's not just going to be a Rubio nomination. Then I think it's going to be a free for all. I think if Vance runs, the field will largely clear. If he doesn't, then I think Marco has got a real good shot at this. But
Sure.
I look at those numbers, I see Nikki Haley's numbers are,
Right.
from what she went through a few years ago, not bad. Ron DeSantis, from what he went through, not bad. Now, people like Youngkin, not really a factor. I was interested to see Rand Paul's numbers so low, given the
Right.
time he spent up here. But look, it's JD Vance's nomination to lose, and he stands to inherit a lot of what Trump has built right now.
And just so people know, Glenn Youngkin is at 0.2% and Senator Rand Paul is at 0.3%. So they really did not factor. Senator Bradley, you have been through so many presidential primaries here in New Hampshire. What jumped out at you about these numbers?
Yeah, no, I agree with Jim. I think it's JD Vance's nomination to lose
Mhm.
as long as he runs for it. He's done a very good job of articulating the president's policies. He was a good senator from Ohio. And I think the other thing that's important too is that Marco Rubio, at least for appearance's sake, seems to be deferring to JD Vance. And,
Right.
certainly a lot of speculation about a Vance-Rubio ticket, which would be, in my view, a home run. I think Marco
Right.
Rubio's done, and Jim, I'm sure you agree with this, as Secretary of State, an exceptional job of articulating, the foreign policy that, we need to restore, some of the problems that Joe
Sure.
Biden created. I think Marco's done a good job. So, the fact that Marco seems to be deferring to Vance, that could be an unstoppable Republican ticket.
So I want to ask about some more numbers. And just a reminder, it's 43% Vance, and then it's just down to barely double digits for Marco Rubio, 10%. I was really taken aback by how positive Republicans feel about these candidates. We have this notion that everybody hates everybody and whatever. The fact is, Republicans like their leaders. They even people you saw this Jim Merrill with Marco Rubio. People like Marco Rubio, but either they're mad about his decision to join the Gang of Eight on immigration or whatever, or they just like Trump better. But this notion that if you like Trump, you hate all of the Republicans is just not true. Vance's approval rating 78%. Rubio's approval rating 71%. DeSantis's approval rating 68%. Nikki Haley 61%. In fact, the only people who are below 60% are Mike Pence at 55 and Tucker Carlson at 49. And that's here in New Hampshire. So Jim Merrill, when people say to you, those New Hampshire Republicans, you guys are those weirdo Warren Rudman, Republicans. That's why, it's a terrible blah, blah, blah. What does this tell you about what people don't get about being a Republican in New Hampshire?
No, I mean, I think that it's an antiquated notion, right? That there's this idea that New Hampshire Republicans are different in degree and
Right.
kind. And I mean, look, like every, party in every state, I mean, there are, variations, but here I look at those numbers and I see, like again, Trump, both, Trump Senior and Trump Junior, right?
Sure.
And other leaders who are part of the administration doing very well. And so I think as you look ahead to 2028, you're going to see someone different than President Trump. Obviously, he
Right.
is a unique figure. But the idea that it's got to be Trump or no one else is just not the case. There are other people that
Right.
retain goodwill, and whether they see this from the mainstream wing, so to speak, from a Nikki Haley's perspective, Marco Rubio is really a hybrid, or a JD Vance.
Right.
It really is interesting, and so I do. And I'd also say this: Tucker
Right.
Carlson polls so low. I think in
Yes.
part he's fighting right now with President Trump, very publicly,
Yep.
very vocally on either side. And I think it underscores how important Trump's voice is. When you're in the middle of a shooting match with him in real time, that's going to hurt.
Right.
But
No
whereas,
kidding.
yeah, whether it's Marco, whether it's Haley, years have passed, things have moved on, and their
Right.
numbers recover. But Tucker is taking, fire right now, and it shows.
It just shows, Senator Bradley, that there's just no one else like Donald Trump in the Republican universe. He's Jupiter in the solar system. He pulls all the other planets, and there's nothing to do. So, would you agree that this, like, I remember when Kasich was going to run? What was that in 2020? He was going to run, and he came up and he did
Well, he
events,
ran in
whatever.
16 too.
But I think he was going to run in 20, like he was going to try again in
Yeah,
20. Was
yeah,
that right?
right.
Or yeah. And he showed up, and I'm like, people thought, oh, Kasich, he's a New Hampshire style Republican. They don't like those Ted Cruz's. They like those Kasich. They didn't like him. I think it's a different party, Senator Bradley, than it was before 2016. Do you agree?
I I think it is. I think people, on the Republican side respect Trump, even if they don't always agree with everything he does or how he says things. I think the results speak for themselves. And I think, that's why Republicans, like Ron DeSantis too. You look at Florida, the results speak for themselves. Rubio's done a great job as Secretary of State. That's why all of these folks have high favorability, because results matter. And when you compare, the results of a state like Florida, or just Florida, for instance, red state to blue states, and the chaos in California, people see that. Republicans see that. All the problems in these blue states, high taxes, high crime, immigration problems, you name it. People are fleeing blue states to go to red states, and we're benefiting from that in New Hampshire. Certainly Florida is. So I think that, it is certainly Donald Trump and results, but it's bigger than just Donald Trump, because, red states are getting results that blue states aren't.
So let me ask you, I was going to go ahead.
No, I was going to say real quickly, Michael, I think it's an interesting phenomenon too, right? Where we like to think we're immune to national trends, to national, we're not, of course we are. And we've seen that time and time again over the election cycle. So we see these leaders, and people have a level of comfort with them. And again, I agree with Jeb, obviously. I think the world of Marco Rubio and the job that he's doing, and his numbers reflect that. But I also think that, we have a batch of Republican leaders at the state level, right, who don't kind of fit in the traditional Trump, MAGA category, even though Democrats try and place them there, right? Remember how much they tried to put Chris Sununu, he's a Trump guy through and through, and they put millions behind that, and they got smoked. They got smoked. They try to do the same thing with Governor Ayotte, and they can't do it. So I think New Hampshire voters are able to kind of see these national figures for who they are and how they lead, and like them, and yet at the same time give New Hampshire leaders the space to be, who they are and develop their own personas and identities as Republicans.
Well, my motto, gentlemen, inside every silver lining, there's a dark cloud. So let's talk about why this sucks for the New Hampshire GOP, because while New Hampshire Republicans may like J.D. Vance, New Hampshire voters hate J.D. Vance. They hate Donald Trump. They hate the Republican brand. And if the top of the ticket is J.D. Vance in 2028, it's going to be very hard slog for Republicans down the ticket in New Hampshire. It's going to be great in Missouri. They're going to love him in Indiana. But in New Hampshire and New England, brutal. Isn't that right, Senator Jeb Bradley, who remembers 2006?
Oh, I remember 2006, but the takeaway that I would have, from 2006 to 2028 is that, we're a long ways away from 2028, and who knows what's going to happen. And, we're a long ways away from the midterms to say what's going to happen. If the situation in the Middle East stabilizes and Americans feel safer and the price of gas has come down again, the economy is really strong right now. And if the affordability issue feels a little bit better with gas prices lower, I think that, Republicans are going to be stronger than you would say that they are on May 15th. Now, there are a lot of ifs there, Michael, and I'm always a glass half full guy. So that's where I see it.
There is no universe, Jim Merrill, not even in the Marvel comic universe, where Doctor Strange can go out and look for them, where New Hampshire is carried by J.D. Vance in the Electoral College in 2028. That universe does not exist.
Look, certainly in recent years, we've seen challenges in terms of how the president polls in New Hampshire, right? Now, let's remember in 2016, he came within a few thousand votes of beating Hillary Clinton there, right? So it's not impossible. And so to Jeb's point, look, we know that, at this point, there's a lifetime to go. And look, it was only 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, maybe, when Democrats were spiking the ball on redistricting and saying, they screwed up. They should have never done this. Look at this. And then Virginia happens, and now everyone's losing their minds. So there's a long way to go. And let's be real. They have an AOC problem. They have a Mamdani problem. There is every possibility that Democrats nominate someone who is unelectable. And that person's not going to go over very well up here either. And so I think there's a long time between now and when we start casting ballots in 2028. I think I'm not prepared to write off New Hampshire for
Well,
anybody.
I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to ask you my one. I obtained a magic wand over the internet. I got it from a Nigerian banker. It's a great deal. Anyway, I'm giving you my magic wand. Each of you, starting with you, Jeb Bradley, you get to pick the Democratic nominee for president in 2028. That would be the one you would most love to see as a solid Republican. Who's your pick?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not going to just pick one. I don't think any of them have a
Yeah,
lot to
but who
run
would you, if you could pick your, like, if who's the ideal Democrat for Republicans to run against?
So, the ideal ticket would be AOC-Newsom or Newsom AOC. Failure in
Okay.
California and a socialist slash
That,
communist on the
that's a
same.
great answer. Jim Merrill, who's your pick?
Yeah, I go with Gavin Mondami, and that's like whatever.
Mondami can't run. He
No, I
wasn't
know, I'm
born in
kidding,
the
I'm kidding.
United States.
But my point is like to Jeb's point, there are really several folks who I just are not going to wear well up here. And I think it's not just the policies, but it's the
Right.
stridency. If an AOC runs the stridency that comes through those progressive policies, I think will turn off independents in droves. So, look,
My dream, my
yeah.
dream ticket has former Vice President Kamala Harris on it. I'm sorry. Just when you read her book, 107 Days, I think this title, which I recommend for it is one of the funniest books you'll ever read. It's all unintentional, but it's all hilarious. She is still utterly lacking in self-awareness. She still doesn't get that the problem was her. And then this week she's out saying, well, we need to pack the Supreme Court. We need to make CC a state. We need to get rid of the Electoral College. Yeah, there's nothing that a small state like New Hampshire needs to do more than to get rid of the Electoral College, which can be totally meaningless in the election. That's where she is still. Jim
Well,
Merrill, give me Kamala. Run,
no, I
Kamala, run.
100% agree with you. And let's remember also, she has no love for New Hampshire, right?
Not a
When
bit.
she ran here, she had a great big first event, and everyone remembers
Yeah,
that in Portsmouth. And then it kind of just went away, and she dropped out early. She had a number of comments about New Hampshire that were not favorable. So if she's the nominee, any strategy of theirs is going to avoid New Hampshire. I suspect that creates another opportunity for us to do well here.
Okay, we're going to wrap up with one last thing that's in the poll. We also polled how Republican primary voters are feeling about the U.S. Senate race, since they're going to decide who the nominee is. And the answer: Johnny Sununu, 73%; Scott Brown, 27%. Senator Bradley, what's your take on this U.S. Senate primary between two popular guys in the party?
Yeah, look, both of them are friends of mine and, worked with John E. when I was in Congress and he was a U.S. Senator, supported Scott Brown in his run against, Senator Shaheen in 2014. Like them both, but I think with, the poll numbers, with Trump's endorsement, John E. is like the person who's going to win. And, if you look at the polling, he's certainly quite close to Chris Pappas. I think that's a huge race. Um, People like Johnny, they like Chris Sununu too. So we'll see what happens, but I think that Scott Brown's got a really, 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 really uphill climb.
Look, everything that Jeb said, I agree with. They're both great guys, and primaries are tough. And it's tough whenever you're on the kind of the short end and you're trying to
Right.
make up that ground and you're trying to build momentum. And I respect Scott Brown a great deal, he's doing what he does, which is work hard, and he's out there working it. And I just don't see any evidence that it's catching, right? I think there was a moment where, maybe he had an opportunity to try and get something as kind of and create the narrative. He hasn't done it. I think Johnny Sununu's run a really smart campaign. He's obviously benefited from some high profile support as well, but he's run a really smart campaign for
Right.
someone who hasn't been on the ballot in a number of years. He seems like he's kind of picked up where he left off and is doing a nice job. So I think, he is on a glide path to earning this primary win. Now we've got some months ahead. And
Right.
then I think you have to ask the question, if you're Chris Pappas and Democrats, who would you least like to see? And I'm confident it's Johnny Sununu.
Oh, sure, absolutely, and that's why when Senator Bradley rightly upbraids me for not being aware of how far it is until the primary, that a lot of things can happen. I'm watching the Sununu-Pappas thing because I don't think it can maintain. I just think that the gravitational pull of Trump is just too much in a state where Republicans just don't do well at the federal level. So I think in the end, it's going to be really tough. But then again, look how close it is now. And if Republicans can find a way to keep this race close, it can make New Hampshire's 2026 look very different from a lot of other states' 2026s.
And it gets back to what we said originally. Kelly Ayotte is the head of the ticket, and she's going to be very, very strong. And I think that helps Republicans up and down the ballot.
You are just underestimating that Warmington juggernaut that's just going to come plowing through.
No, I'm
the
not,
charisma,
Michael.
the power of her ideas. It's so exciting. As Andy Bashir, the head of the Democratic Governors Association, said in this week during a visit, I think she may have a shot. So with that kind of ringing endorsement, I don't know. What are you guys talking about? Look, we got to, my ringing endorsement is for always pay attention to what Senator Jeb Bradley says. Always avoid Jim Merrill, particularly in public spaces. Really appreciate you guys being part of our ranked punditry here on the New Hampshire Journal podcast.
I don't know,
Thank
Jim,
you so much.
I don't know. You can put me in the doghouse with Jim, I think, too, Michael.
Thanks. Look, you can be as nice as you want to him, Senator. He's never going to pick up the check. Just keep that in mind. No matter how nice you are, it's not going to happen. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Jim.